In today's video, I'll be painting one of the new Krootox Rampagers to a display quality level.
Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching PHLANS Miniatures. A couple of videos ago I painted a ghost kill battlesuit for my Tau army, but I have to admit that while I was doing it, I was really just itching to paint some of the new Kroot releases from the hunting pack box, and the Tau was the next best thing I could paint while I was waiting for that to arrive. Fortunately, I didn't have to wait too long, and my box arrived even before I finished the ghost kill, and I could start painting the best models in the box, the Krootox Rampagers.
I tried to paint this dynamic duo quite alien and vicious looking as Kroot should be, and I hope you guys will like them, but be warned that this paint job is going to be a bit complex.
So if you want to see how I painted the alien purple skin of the Krootox, including some freehand spots to make him really stand out, all the various leather harnesses, the true metallic elements, including a freehand Kroot design on the shoulder armor as well, and of course the greenish yellow of the rider with the red quills, then let's get started. So when I started this, I had an idea that instead of using my usual method where I would just highlight up from the black, I would go for an actual base coat on almost all the elements and then I will shade and highlight after. So this looks a little bit like what Games Workshop would do, but believe me, I will do it in a very different way. But because I decided to go with this method, I'm going to be selecting my colors accordingly as well. And what I mean by that is that I'm not going to use the same method that you would see in a Games Workshop video where you would select the midtone, so basically the color that you want the mini to be, and then you shade that and highlight that, but that color will still remain your main color. Instead, I'm going to be using something that is more like a shadow color. I will still need to shade this a little bit to make it darker in the shadows, but mostly I'm just going to be highlighting it up later on. And the reason I'm explaining this is because I'm going to be using the same method for basically the entirety of the model, even including the metallics. The nice thing about this method is that I can just kind of paint the whole model from the get-go, even though it's not going to look exactly like it's going to look at the end, but it will give me some ideas about where I can put my highlights and overall which directions I'm going with my colors. And as you can see, I can just take a really big kind of frayed brush and just go to town on the mini, because for now all I need to do is to just cover everything. Once I covered the skin of the Krootox, I did the same thing with the Kroot. And I wanted him to be green, so once again I'm going to paint him a relatively darker shade of green. So something that is going to be kind of like the second shadow color on him rather than the actual midtone. And sometimes I don't get the colors right exactly that way I had them in my head, but that's perfectly fine, especially with this method, because as you will see with this paint job, it doesn't matter what your base coat looks like. Well, it does matter, but it's not the end of the world if you have to modify it later on. For example, on this chest plate that he has, this bony armor, I just couldn't get the color right, and the same was true actually for his beak as well. Whatever I ended up with was just not the shade I imagined this thing to be. So for both the chest and also the beak, I actually used the contrast paints to shade them, but also to modify the color to something that was much more like the way I imagined. Contrast paints are actually super useful even for high quality paint jobs, because you can use them kind of like inks, but they also have somewhat different properties and you can use them as shades as well. So they are just really versatile and super useful paints in general. The Krootox has a lot of leather elements on him, and I decided that I would paint them in two separate colors so that they don't just meld into each other. Sometimes it's worth painting similar things in different colors just so that you have a little bit more variety on the model. And to really differentiate them, I decided also that one of them is going to be a very saturated color, so this Dumble Brown, and the other one I'm going to be using something really desaturated for, and that's going to be Rhinox Hide. It's probably not the most important thing, but one of the reasons why I decided to go for Citadel colors for the leather parts is because they are satin. So when they dry, they end up having this little shine, which actually is quite beneficial for something that is leather. I will be using various different methods to make this more pronounced, to actually make the leather bits a little bit even more shiny than they are initially, but it doesn't hurt if you already have this effect a little bit from the get-go. At this point, I base coated quite a few bits on the model, but there were quite a few still left. But I was also a little bit impatient and I wanted to get an idea about how the skin would look like, so I decided to shade it and highlight it a bit. And as I said, I'm not going to be using the Games Workshop method here, so I'm definitely not using a shade because that would just ruin the whole skin with blotchiness and everything. So instead, I'm using an airbrush and I'm shooting dark sea blue to represent the shadows. I'm using this color because I want the base to have a similar color, and this is going to represent kind of the light bouncing off the base. And well, dark sea blue is also just a really nice shadow color. And the way I'm doing it is basically a reverse zenithal highlight, which probably has a name, but I'm not sure what that is. So I'm just shooting the paint from below, and I have it super diluted so that I can build up the layers and establish a nice color transition, and I can control how much paint gets on the model. And once I'm done with it, you can already see how nicely shaded the model looks. And now I can just work on the highlights a little bit as well. And doing that is just as easy as the shading, but this time I need to brighten up the original color by adding something a little bit lighter into it, which in this case is brown rose. After that, this becomes more or less like a zenithal highlight once again, but this time from the correct angle, with the exception that I'm controlling this way more than I would the zenithal highlights. I'm actually shooting this specifically into certain areas where I want the light to be. And once I reach full coverage with this, so it doesn't matter how many more layers I will apply, the color is not going to change, it really fully covers that place where I want it to be, then I will add some more brown rose into the mix and highlight even further, making sure that I don't cover the previous color fully. I will just go even higher where the light would hit. And now that this is mostly applied, you can probably see that the original base coat color is still there somewhere in the shadows, in between the dark sea blue and this highlight, but it's definitely not the midtone anymore, right? Actually, this is going to be our midtone because we are going to be using the brush to work on this further and highlight it up even more. After the airbrushing phase, it's always good to apply a little bit of black and just make sure that you are blacking out everything that is not supposed to be painted at this point. And then I can just continue painting in all the base coats of the different elements, like for example the quills of these guys. I saw a picture of a red quilled Krootox rider actually in the new Tau Codex, and I decided at that point that I will have my guys also with red hair or quills because it just looks really cool, so that's why they are red. Alright, time to paint some metals, and this time I decided to go with true metallics just because lately I've been painting so much non-metallics that I thought it would be nice to go back and try something that I really haven't used in a long time. But once again, I wanted to use basically a shadow color for the metals as well, and that's why I'm using gunmetal gray from Vallejo, because this is super dark, so I can just leave it without shading and immediately start highlighting it after. Same for the golds. I went with Viking gold, which is really dark for what it is. You can of course shade it further down, but I decided that I would just leave it as is and then use brighter colors to highlight it later on. We are slowly getting there. We are almost there where we have everything covered, so now I'm using some ground texture from AK Interactive to cover the base. And here is another neat trick that you can use contrast paints for, or in this case Express colors from Vallejo. As you can see, this ground texture that I used is quite bright, so I can just use the contrast paint or the Express color and just paint over it directly. And this black lotus, which is supposed to be the black in the range, is not really black, as you can see. It actually is quite close to what dark sea blue is. It has this like greenish bluish tint to it, so it works perfectly fine with the shade that we used on the underside of the model. So now that everything is base coated, it's time to highlight the skin further. I laid all the groundwork with the airbrush, and now it's time to use the brush to really put in the final highlights. And because the airbrush has this tendency to desaturate colors and make them a little bit lighter, I'm using basically the same mix that I used through the airbrush, but now with the brush. And the trick to this entire process is going to be the consistency of the paint, because I used an airbrush before. That means that the skin looks extremely smooth, and it has this like typical airbrush texture on it, which now we want to break up with the brush. But if I used very thick paint, there would be a huge disconnect between this layer and the one that was created by the airbrush. So the trick is to use quite diluted paint, especially in the beginning, and establish where the light should go. And once you already kind of integrated this into the airbrushed layer, then you can go in with a bit thicker color and establish the full highlight with full coverage in the middle. So first, usually you see me with kind of diluted color creating this blotch where the light is supposed to be, and then I let it dry and I go in with another layer, concentrating more and more in the middle, and then once this is more or less covering everything, I can come in with like basically a base consistency paint and really make sure that the middle of the highlight is fully covered. The other important thing I'm doing here is also to create texture. on top of the very smooth layer of airbrush paint. Because everything is so smooth, there is not much visual interest. Of course, I'm using the paint to pick out the details that I couldn't do with the airbrush. So for example, the veins, the muscles, these small muscles that are inbuilt into the bigger ones. But on top of that, I'm also creating little scratches and dots here and there so that there is a little bit more visual interest everywhere. And I don't care too much if these show up as visible brush strokes, because later we are going to be using a method to smooth these out. Not all of them, because some of them actually need to be there, but some of the more visible ones we are going to smooth out later. And I just go around the model and highlight everything with that color, and once I'm finished, I just add more brown rows into the mix until I end up with just brown rows in the end. Now I'm going to highlight this even further than just brown rows, but before I do that, I wanted to add even more visual interest into the model. On some of the pictures about the Kroot, I saw that the Krootox occasionally had these like spots, like for example a leopard would have, and I assume they just ate something that had the spots and then they incorporated this into their genetics, and they look quite cool and they break up the skin, so I thought, why not? And they are quite easy to do. The method I was using is that I decided that they are kind of emanating from the back of the model. So the further down you go, the less of them there are, or the smaller they are. And once I established where they would be, I used dark sea blue to create the base color and the shape. And the shape was actually a tricky thing, because initially I thought that they could be kind of irregular and it's going to be fine, but turns out that that's not true. Whenever I left them with these like irregular shapes, so like little bits jutting out on the side or whatever, when they are not really like circular, they just looked weird. They didn't really feel organic, I guess. So in order to make them feel like this is part of an animal, I had to clear it up a little bit and make sure that they don't have to be circles, but they have to be kind of rounded at least. But once the shape was established, it was relatively easy, because I just kept adding yellow into the dark sea blue and I kept making the middle of the spots brighter. And there you go, now our Kroots have spots and they look like they can blend into an environment that is kind of like the one that is on our base. Alright, now that we have our spots, I went with salmon to establish my final highlights on the model. But this is actually not going to be our final highlight. I'm just going to leave it like this before I go back to it again once I painted everything else, because sometimes it's really difficult to see whether the contrast is right on the model and whether you actually like it or not until you really see the full thing. So usually nowadays what I do is that I just go as far as I think it's fine, and then I paint in everything else, and at the end of the paint job I go back and see, do I need more highlights or do I need more shading, and then I just correct it. I was done with the skin for now, and it was time to paint in all the other elements. First I went back to the beak. And one of the things that I had to take into account is that there is so much brown on this model, at least in this interpretation that I did, that I had to differentiate them. So first of all, I repainted the beak a little bit from what I had before. As I said back then, you just have to modify it, right? You don't have to leave it as is. Later you can just apply a filter or completely repaint it if you want. So I repainted it, and I wanted to use something that has like a greenish yellowish tint to it, so that it's going to be different from all the other elements that are going to be also brown, like the leathers. At the same time, I also decided that the chest, this armor, basically the bone that is protecting him, is going to be the same material as the one on the beak. So in the end, I used basically the same colors to paint it as well. And then I moved on to the two different leathers. And the most important thing on the leather was that I wanted to apply texture to it so that it looks beaten up and used. So on both types of leather, you will see me doing a lot of little scratches, and of course I'm going to also edge highlight all of it. And the way I do this is that I will do more scratches the closer I get to the highlight zone. So basically where the light would hit, I would have the most amount of overlapping scratches. And once I'm done with the scratches, I'm going to be using sepia ink to integrate everything, to add a little bit color back and just make the shadows more interesting. And later I will correct this even further. I just want to, once again, just like with the skin, kind of make it good enough for now. And then at the end, in the final stage, we are going to come back and modify it a little bit. And as I said, I use the same method once again for the other leather as well, just with different colors. And to integrate it all together, instead of the sepia ink, I use Gorgonta Fur from Contrast Paints, because it essentially works like an ink as well. I'm mostly done with the Krootox, so it's time to put some color on the Kroot as well. And the method here is super easy, because I started from a Russian green. I'm going to highlight it up towards a green and towards a yellow a little bit as well. It's almost a no-brainer for me to go from green to yellow, because it just looks so good. If you just highlight green to green, so basically a dark green to a brighter green, it's gonna be okay, but it's not gonna look super interesting. But if you add a little bit yellow into the highlights, suddenly it becomes a much more interesting and much more vibrant paint job. After I was done with the Kroot, I decided to add a freehand on this armor plate that the Krootox has attached. And once again, I saw some artwork in the rulebook, and I just wanted to not copy it, but do something similar. And oh boy, you can't even imagine how many times I tried this, and I repainted it like 3 times. I'm not sure why it was so difficult. It shouldn't be, but it was. But the end result at least looks quite good, I think, so I'm not too unhappy with it. But holy crap, I really took a lot of time doing this. Fortunately, doing the quills took no time at all, because all I needed to do was apply brighter and brighter shades of reds to make them stand out more. And while I was doing the quills, I decided to also highlight the shield a little bit more, because, you know, I didn't spend enough time on it. So now I just messed it up even further, actually having to repaint that little triangle once again after I was done with my highlights. But with that, I arrived at the metallics, and this was the part that I was dreading a little bit, because I really don't like working with metallics for some reason. I don't practice it enough to be really good at it. So I decided to kind of do it like the way I would do non-metallic metal, apply the same principle, kind of creating volumetric highlights on the metals. And because I didn't really shade these metals, I just went up and up in highlights as much as I could. So I started with basically the same metallics that I used initially, and because there is a little bit of dark sea blue that hit them when I was doing the shading, it was still a bit darker, so that actually acted as a highlight color. And then I just kept adding brighter and brighter steel. The only thing that received a little bit of special attention and a little bit different technique was this breastplate that the Kroot has, because here I used basically the same method that I did with the leather, but this time with metallics. So I was just applying more and more scratches as I went into the middle. The gold elements were quite easy because there are not that many of them and they're relatively small. So I used basically the same method, where I was just painting with brighter and brighter golds as I went up in highlights. And with that, the model was essentially done, but remember that I told you that I would still apply some more highlights to the skin because I felt that it was not exactly where I wanted it to be before I did the final step, which comes right after this, and it's going to be very important. So I decided to go back and smooth out and add some more highlights to the skin with brown rose and a little bit of yellow added to it. And the reason why I'm doing this is because once I applied all the other colors and all the other highlights around it, I just felt that the skin is not highlighted enough in the end before I tone it down with the next step. So I'm essentially repeating the last step that I did when I was highlighting the skin, but this time with this different color. Instead of the salmon, I used the brown rose but added a lot of yellow into it so that it's actually brighter than the salmon was. And concentrate mostly on the head and the shoulders, where your eyes would be looking mostly when you look at the model, and where the light would hit the model the most as well. And once I'm done with this, I'm going to add one more step, which is going to transform the model quite a bit, and I'm going to be using a ton of inks for this. First of all, I'm going to be using transparent burnt umber to enhance the leather bits a little bit more. So I'm going to be using this mostly in the shadows, because I felt that there's just not enough contrast in the leather. So I'm just going to make it darker and shinier and a bit more colorful in the shadows with this. And the nice thing about inks is that they are super transparent, so I can just apply this on the textured surface without really losing the details, right? So all those scratches are still going to be there. They're going to be more integrated and darker, but they're not going to be completely covered by the ink. I'm just kind of applying it as a filter, modifying the the color as well as how bright it is. But even after the burnt umber, I didn't feel that it's enough, so I added some purple into the burnt umber, darkening it further down, adding even more color into it, and then used it in the deepest shadows. And that took care of the leather bits, but I wanted to modify the Krootox skin as well. So I used once again the same purple, but this time I added black into it and used it through the airbrush. And I know that this might seem like madness because I spent so much time on the skin and now I might just ruin it with the airbrush, but keep in mind that this is very transparent because it's inks and I am using them diluted, and I'm very careful, of course, and apply layer by layer the paint so that I control how much color actually gets on the model. But when you watch me do this, you probably can see how much this adds to the vibrancy of the model, because with the highlighting process, I usually add some white into the model and I desaturate it so it loses color as I go along. So now with this step, I can restore that color, and at the same time, I can also smooth out some of those scratches and little dots that I did, the texture that I created. But at the same time, I'm not completely obscuring them, right? They're still there. The transparent ink just goes over them, modifies them, darkens them down, but they are still there in the shadows. And for my final trick, I'm going to be using laser yellow through the airbrush, and this is going to look like complete madness now. I'm just going to spray this over the highlights, and this is barely going to modify the color in the end, but in my experience, this goes a long way towards smoothing everything out. So after this, the end result is going to look way more glazed and smoother than it actually was. I didn't really take too much attention or too much time to really smooth everything perfectly out, because I just knew I would do this in the end. I would do the shading from below with the ink, and then I would use laser yellow from the top, and the two together are going to make this butter smooth, or well, at least close. And now I was actually done. I just needed to add a couple of tufts to the base to add some more color in there. I even added a little bit of contrast red into those tufts because I wasn't satisfied with how red they actually were. And with that, the model was done, and the end result looks like this.
Thank you very much for watching. I hope you guys liked it, and if you made it this far, please consider giving it a like and subscribe. See you in the next one.